Frieren Beyond Journey's End is not perfectly written, and acknowledging that doesn't diminish what the series achieves, but it does explain why so many viewers walk away conflicted despite its critical acclaim, because Frieren Beyond Journey's End operates on a storytelling philosophy that prioritizes atmosphere, restraint, and emotional implication over narrative clarity, momentum, and transformation. And while that approach resonates deeply with some audiences, it exposes structural weaknesses that others find impossible to ignore. One of the most persistent criticisms online is pacing. As Frieren Beyond Journey's End often allows entire episodes to unfold without clear narrative progression, relying instead on mood and reflection, which can feel meditative when binged, but frustrating when watched weekly, creating a disconnect between intent and experience. This pacing issue is compounded by the series' episodic structure, where emotional beats frequently resolve quietly and internally rather than through visible change, making it difficult for some viewers to track character growth across arcs. Frieren herself exemplifies this problem, as her development is intentionally subtle, to the point that many fans struggle to identify when or how she has meaningfully changed, leading to debates about whether her arc represents nuanced realism or narrative stagnation. Supporting characters like Fern and Stark face similar criticism, as their roles often orbit Frieren's perspective rather than asserting independent trajectories, which can make them feel emotionally secondary despite their screen time. Another writing issue stems from Frieren's reliance on thematic repetition, as concepts like time, regret, memory, and loss are revisited so frequently that they risk losing impact, especially when new scenes echo familiar emotional conclusions without challenging or expanding the underlying ideas. This repetition feeds into a broader concern that the series rarely interrogates its own themes, presenting them as accepted truths rather than evolving philosophies, which can make the narrative feel static rather than exploratory. The anime's restraint, while often praised, also creates distance, as Frieren Beyond Journey's End deliberately avoids emotional catharsis, dramatic confrontation, or heightened stakes, leaving some viewers emotionally disengaged rather than contemplative. This is particularly noticeable in conflict resolution, where tension is often diffused quietly rather than escalated, reinforcing the perception that the story resists disruption rather than embracing it. Fans online also point to tonal uniformity as a flaw, arguing that the series' consistently subdued atmosphere causes episodes to blur together, reducing memorability and diminishing the sense of progression across the journey. Even Frieren Beyond Journey's End's strongest elements, such as its beautiful animation and melancholic soundtrack, can inadvertently mask narrative thinness by creating emotional resonance where structural payoff is limited. Another point of contention is accessibility, as Frieren often assumes emotional literacy and patience from its audience without offering sufficient narrative scaffolding, which can make viewers feel excluded rather than invited into its reflective space. This has fueled polarized discourse, where criticism is sometimes dismissed as a lack of maturity or attention span, further entrenching division rather than fostering discussion. Ultimately, Frieren's writing flaws don't stem from incompetence, but from an extreme commitment to a specific storytelling philosophy that values quiet continuity over visible evolution, meaning that the series succeeds brilliantly within its chosen lane while struggling to adapt to audiences seeking clearer arcs, sharper escalation, or emotional release. Frieren isn't flawed because it fails to say something meaningful. It's flawed because it says the same meaningful things in ways that don't always grow, surprise, or challenge themselves. And for some viewers, that consistency feels profound, while for others, it feels limiting. This tension is why Frieren remains so debated online, not because it lacks quality, but because it exposes the gap between what modern audiences want from anime storytelling and what quiet, reflective narratives are willing to provide, making Frieren a beautifully written series that is nevertheless far from perfect. And those limitations become even clearer when examining how Frieren handles payoff, because the series often invests heavily in emotional setup without delivering moments that feel transformative in the present, relying instead on delayed meaning that may or may not resonate depending on the viewer's patience and emotional alignment. Many fans online argue that while delayed payoff can be powerful, Frieren overuses it to the point where anticipation dulls rather than sharpens, as scenes resolve in expected ways that reinforce existing themes instead of recontextualizing them. This predictability feeds into criticism that the anime confuses consistency with progression, presenting emotional beats that feel complete in isolation but rarely compound into something larger or more complex over time. Another recurring issue involves Frieren's internal conflict, which remains largely unchallenged by external forces, meaning that growth is driven by remembrance rather than confrontation, a choice that aligns with the series' tone but limits dramatic friction. Without sustained pressure, Frieren's realizations can feel incremental to the point of invisibility, prompting viewers to question whether they are witnessing character development or simply reinterpretation of the same emotional state. This also affects the narrative's ability to surprise, as Frieren rarely allows its characters to make mistakes that carry lasting consequences, reinforcing the perception that the story exists in a safe emotional space where reflection replaces risk. Fans online frequently compare this approach to more dynamic, long-form storytelling, noting that while Frieren excels at mood and atmosphere, it struggles to generate narrative momentum that extends beyond individual episodes. This gap becomes especially noticeable during longer arcs, where the absence of escalation can make the journey feel emotionally flat despite high production values. Another source of frustration is the way Frieren's world-building often remains suggestive rather than concrete, hinting at larger histories, systems, and conflicts without fully engaging them, which can make the setting feel like a backdrop for introspection rather than a living world that pushes back against the characters. This restraint contributes to the sense that Frieren is more concerned with preserving its emotional tone than exploring the consequences of its ideas, leading some viewers to feel that the series prioritizes comfort over challenge. None of these issues invalidate Frieren's achievements, but they do explain why its writing divides audiences so sharply, as the same qualities that create a meditative, emotionally gentle experience also impose ceilings on tension, surprise, and growth. Frieren doesn't fail at storytelling. It commits so fully to a narrow emotional bandwidth that it leaves little room for deviation and for viewers seeking evolution rather than reflection. That commitment can feel less like artistic purity and more like creative limitation, reinforcing the idea that Frieren is thoughtfully written, beautifully produced, and emotionally sincere, but ultimately not immune to critique or beyond reproach.